Hash Picard introduced and quickly killed Star Trek's most toxic love story. Star Trek. Picard was many things, a swan song, a nostalgic reunion, and an exploration of legacy. But buried within its complex storytelling and layered emotional arcs was one of Star Trek's most unexpected experiments. A love story so toxic, it could only burn bright for a moment before self-destructing. Between the shadows of synthetic life and the ghosts of past trauma, Picard quietly introduced and then brutally dismantled one of the franchise's most self-destructive romances, a relationship that said more about Star Trek's changing emotional maturity than any photon torpedo or moral debate ever could. A love story born in trauma, Raffi Musiker and Cristobal Rios. When Star Trek Picard launched in 2020, fans were introduced to a new generation of characters orbiting the legend of Jean-Luc Picard. Among them was Commander Raffi Musiker Michelle Hurd, a brilliant yet damaged ex-Starfleet officer whose relationship with Picard had collapsed under the weight of secrets and betrayal. Enter Cristobal Rios Santiago Cabrera, a former Starfleet officer haunted by his own ghosts, quite literally, as his ship was populated with holograms of himself, each embodying fragments of his fractured psyche. From the moment they met, Raffi and Rios shared a broken kind of understanding. Both were survivors of Starfleet's failures, both had turned to self-destruction as a coping mechanism, and both had a spark of charisma wrapped in pain. It wasn't a healthy connection, it was a collision, and that's what made it so compelling. Their chemistry wasn't rooted in romantic ideals. It was in recognition, two people who'd fallen out of love with Starfleet and perhaps, deep down, with themselves. Theirs was a love story written not in starlight, but in the cold glow of regret and addiction. The addiction of comfort. Raffi's struggles with substance abuse were among Picard's most raw and human depictions of trauma in the Star Trek universe. Unlike The Next Generation, where inner demons were often wrapped up neatly by the end of an episode, Picard leaned into the idea that recovery was messy, ongoing, and sometimes lonely. Rios, with his quiet melancholy and world-weary cynicism, became both a mirror and an enabler for Raffi. They weren't each other's saviors. They were each other's relapse triggers. When Raffi flirted with hope, Rios reminded her that the world wasn't so simple. When Rios began to soften, Raffi's pain anchored him back to cynicism. Their relationship existed in a cycle of temporary warmth and inevitable emotional coldness, a dynamic recognizable to anyone who's loved someone broken in the same way they are. What Picard did brilliantly and brutally was refuse to romanticize this. It didn't turn Raffi and Rios into a will-they-won't-they comfort couple. Instead, their connection was shown as something both necessary and poisonous, a temporary alliance in a universe that had taken too much from both of them. When Trauma Meets Tenderness, by Star Trek, Picard Season 1, Episode 8, Broken Pieces, the emotional scaffolding between Raffi and Rios started to crumble, not because of betrayal, but because of vulnerability. Rios's backstory, the death of his captain and the cover-up that followed, was another wound that Raffi couldn't heal. And Raffi's deep resentment toward Starfleet's hypocrisy was a mirror of Rios's self-loathing. Their shared trauma was the foundation of their intimacy. But shared trauma isn't the same as shared healing. When Raffi finally reached out to him in compassion, with genuine care, not flirtation, Rios responded in kind. But even in their moments of quiet connection, there was no illusion that this was a love that could last. Picard showed them as two people orbiting each other in pain, not building toward a happy ending. This was Star Trek's most emotionally honest romance, and its most doomed. Season 2, The Illusion of Stability. When Picard returned for Season 2, it seemed for a brief moment that Raffi and Rios had found balance. The two had a gentle familiarity, a shorthand of affection that hinted at a relationship that had evolved off-screen. But in true toxic fashion, their bond was less about partnership and more about proximity. Raffi leaned on Rios to fill the emotional void left by the death of Elnor, her surrogate son. Rios leaned on Raffi because she made him feel needed. They mistook emotional dependence for love, and Picard didn't shy away from showing that. Even when Rios found himself drawn to Teresa, the 21st century doctor he met during their time travel mission, it wasn't a betrayal. It was an awakening. For Rios, Teresa represented something Raffi never could: peace. A chance to live in a world that wasn't defined by Starfleet's ghosts or personal demons. When he chose to stay in the past with Teresa and her son, it wasn't a rejection of Raffi, it was a release. And for Raffi, it was the final proof that her most intimate connections were with people destined to leave her behind. Star Trek's most toxic love story, and why it worked. Raffi and Rios' relationship never exploded into melodrama, but it was quietly devastating. It was the kind of love story Star Trek rarely told, one that didn't need betrayal or infidelity to be toxic. The toxicity was in the dependence, the avoidance, the quiet understanding that they were bad for each other, but couldn't quite let go. It was a love story that mirrored addiction itself, soothing in the short term, destructive in the long run. Unlike classic Star Trek romances built on ideals, Spock and Christine Chapel's restrained longing, Riker and Troy's slow burn destiny, or even Picard and Crusher's mature affection, Raffi and Rios embodied the messiness of trauma bonding. Their connection wasn't about hope for the future, it was about survival in the present. And perhaps that's why it couldn't last. Picard's emotional evolution. The brilliance of Picard was how it used Raffi and Rios' relationship to reflect the show's broader themes. That legacy isn't always heroic, that love doesn't always redeem, and that healing sometimes means letting go. In the world of the next generation, love stories were often interrupted by duty. But in Picard, duty had already failed them. All that was left was the wreckage, and the question of what came next. Raffi's journey after Rios' departure was quietly tragic. She tried to rebuild herself by mentoring Seven of Nine, another soul shaped by trauma and resilience. Their bond, slowly growing into romance, became a healthier evolution of Raffi's emotional life. Seven didn't need Raffi to fix her. She needed Raffi to stand beside her. By contrast, Rios' ending, choosing to remain in the past, finding happiness and dying in a simple transport accident, felt like poetic closure. He escaped the endless cycle of pain Raffi represented, trading chaos for peace. For once, Star Trek didn't glorify sacrifice or duty. It glorified the radical act of choosing happiness, even if it meant leaving the stars behind. The anatomy of a burnout relationship. Raffi and Rios' romance perfectly captured what therapists call a burnout relationship, one where both partners are emotionally exhausted from past traumas and seek refuge in each other without the capacity to heal. They connected through mutual understanding, but that same understanding became the weight that dragged them down. Neither was ready to be vulnerable without collapsing. Neither could love without self-sabotage. In that sense, Picard didn't kill off their romance prematurely. It let it die the only way it could, quietly, naturally, without spectacle. Like two stars collapsing into themselves, their love burned bright and then vanished into silence. The legacy of Raffi and Rios. For all its grand plots about synthetic life, temporal paradoxes, and Borg alliances, Star Trek, Picard will be remembered for its emotional daring. It wasn't afraid to depict love as something ugly, codependent, and real. Raffi and Rios' relationship wasn't tragic because one of them died or betrayed the other. It was